Are we live?
We are live.
We're live on Instagram and Facebook. I'm Debbie from Living Energy Farm, and I'm going to do a workshop on garden planning for Earth Day. And there's some people here at the farm who are doing the workshop, and there's also some people doing the workshop from through social media. And if anybody has questions, just at any time, you can just interrupt me. I've been the seed growing manager at LEF for about 7 years, and I've been growing seeds and food for about 15 years or so in Central Virginia. Of course, everything about growing food and farming is very place specific. So I can give a lot of specifics about how things are grown here. Of course, it's all going to depend on where you live and the climate that you live, especially when we get into specific crops and what's the best things to grow and that sort of thing, and varieties. I have a lot of opinions about that, but most of it pertains to this area. All right, so I guess I'll start with okay, so you want to grow a garden. So the first question is where are you going to put it? What are you going to grow? I mean, a lot of that is what are you going to grow, of course, has a lot to do with what you want, but also how much space you have. We grow a lot in the field, and then we also, have our small little garden. And I definitely recommend having, starting somewhat small. If you get too ambitious at the beginning, it's easy to get overwhelmed. One rule of thumb that I've read is that a lot of people get excited at planting season, but basically the time it takes to plant something, it's going to take twice as much time to weed it and water it, and then it's going to take twice as much time again, four times as much time to harvest it and process it. So, you get excited and plant as much as you have energy for, and then you get overwhelmed when you're trying to actually take care of it. So you want to keep that in mind. And so when you're picking a spot for a garden, there's a lot of considerations. I think what I would definitely recommend is to keep it as close to your house as you can. In permaculture, they talk about different zones. I believe they usually put the herb garden, the vegetable garden in zone 1 or 2, which is pretty much right outside of your house. A big advantage of that is that you're going to see it more often. You're going to notice when things are going badly or going well or whatever. You get to enjoy it more. There's also a really big part of gardening is protecting your crop from critters. So the things that are less edible to wild animals, you can put a little further away. But I definitely recommend to keep it, pretty close to your house. In most places, you're probably going to want to fence it somehow. If you're near your house, you might have a dog, you might have cats to help keep the critters under control. That's really, really good to have the garden in a place where you have a lot of dog or cat activity. Dogs for the groundhogs and rabbits and stuff, and cats for the little, rodent-y things. That helps quite a lot. So you want to use your pets to your advantage when you're growing a garden, because that's more demoralizing than anything. A lot of people try to grow gardens. They're all excited and stuff's growing, and then just one morning they get up and everything's wiped out, and that's just the worst. You put all that work into it, and then so it's a really big consideration is how you're going to protect it. Another consideration, of course, sunlight is a really big consideration. That might be your number one, because other things you can put in a fence, you can put in irrigation, you can build fertility, but you really need sunshine. And of course you can create sunshine, but if you're trying to, I've seen some valiant attempts at shade gardening that I'm man, just don't do it. Just put it in the sun. It's especially when you're growing more in the winter, you need quite, your southern clearance needs to be pretty good. Having it on the south side of your house is nice, because then you have a maintained solar clearing for the southern part of your house, which is useful if your house, of course, has any solar features. Also good for natural light and mold control and that sort of thing. So when you're having a plan for a clearing on the south side of your house is generally a good idea. You put your garden in the sun, somewhat close to your house. Probably put a fence around it. Or maybe you just have a dog who's really on top of things, so maybe you don't need a fence, but whatever you have to keep the critters out. And then your next consideration are fertility and water. So you need to be able to reach your garden with with some kind of irrigation. So, there's like, some people think, oh, I'll just use a lot of mulch, or I'll grow things that are more drought tolerant or whatever if they don't have water in a certain place. Generally speaking, though, you're just going to have so much better yields if you give things as much water as they need. So while there's times to be stingy with water, generally I think it's like, you want to plan for that when you're choosing your garden. So, you want to be able to reach it with a hose. You want to be able to, maybe you have some like natural water you want to pump if you don't want to use city water, that sort of thing. And then, so you got your water, you got your critter protection, you got your sunshine, and then fertility, of course, is another big consideration. So it's really nice to start out with like soil that's pretty fertile, but we don't always have that. But I mean, even soil that's naturally fertile, you're going to have to add some fertility. The soil in this climate is naturally acidic because of the amount of rainfall we have. So you want some kind of pH modification. And usually you can use lime, you can use ashes, but you want to raise your pH a little bit. It's going to be naturally in the like low 6 range, and you want to get it, closer to 7. A lot of the Virginia Cooperative Extension offers a free soil test, so I definitely recommend doing that. And they can give you recommendations for how much lime to use, and also how much other soil amendments to use based on what you're going to grow. And you just say like, mixed vegetables or something if it's a garden. But you can do it. You can do it for free for Virginia Tech, or you can pay more money and get some fancier tests somewhere else. But I've been very happy with using the free service through the Cooperative Extension. So the other, when you get your soil test, it's going to tell you I would definitely recommend getting like a organic matter percentage, and it'll give you macronutrient recommendations based on the crops that you're growing. So when I'm talking about organic farming, of course, organic gardening, that's what we do. But it's good to know, to speak the language a little bit of like conventional farming, which is, a conventional farmer is looking at NPK. That stands for nitrogen is N, phosphorus is P, and potassium is K. And those are the 3 major micronutrients that all plants need. Some of them need more of one thing than others. If you're using like compost, if you're using manure, those have all 3 of those things in it already. Some people say that compost is like perfectly balanced nutrition for plants, and that is true. Compost is great. If you make your own compost, that's great. But compost is pretty expensive too, to get enough of it to provide the macronutrients. So we use some compost, we make some compost, but it's not the basis of our fertility plan, just because we don't have the resources to be making huge amounts of compost, and it's expensive to buy. So we use it to kind of build up soil. When you have a new piece of ground, we always start with animal manure because it's cheaper than compost, and it's not perfectly balanced nutrition. It has a lot of phosphorus. It has some nitrogen. It has some potassium, but not really enough. So we use animal manure, but then we also use, in the garden, we sometimes use wood ashes. Out in the field, we use potassium sulfide. Anyway, we use potassium out in the field, like in a mined potassium. But if you're doing like a small scale, you could do, manure and wood ashes is pretty balanced nutrition, the 2 of those together. And then also, just the more organic matter you have in the soil, so there's like there's different schools of thought with fertility. But it's good to kind of speak a little bit of all of them, in my opinion. Knowing what NPK is and what the different nutrients do in plants is good to know, so that if you have a deficiency, you can like kind of figure it out and then add more of the correct nutrient. But there's also this kind of like biological philosophy of soil nutrition, which is that if you can just feed all the biological activity in the soil enough, that all the bugs and everything that lives in the soil will create the nutrition that your plants need, which is pretty cool. So, and really that comes down to keeping the soil covered, and organic matter, so that you can keep all the life in your soil happy. And I mean, I think modifying pH too is pretty important for that, because that you can't do just by adding organic matter. So adding organic matter is a really important part of organic fertility. It's probably like the single biggest thing that you're going to do. Like, other stuff is fairly easy. Adding organic matter is just this ongoing thing of, ongoing consideration in like your management. If you're doing a small a garden, and especially if you live in a city, the easiest way to add organic matter is through mulching, and you can bring in all kinds of different things to be mulch that are pretty cheap and sometimes just waste products. But you need to be careful about what you're bringing into your garden to make sure it's not, like, if you're going to use spoiled hay, you need to be really careful about any kind of, there might be some kind of pesticide residue in that hay. There might be like weed seeds. So you might want to like talk to the person you're getting it from, make sure it hasn't been sprayed, maybe look at the field and see if there are any nasty weeds if you're going to use something like that. Or you can just really, with the weeds, it's like, or you can just really keep on top of the weeding. That's kind of what we do. But it is a consideration, especially if you're doing on a larger scale where, if there's some bad perennial weeds in that hay, it can really kind of get out of hand and be really hard to manage. Because there is a lot of waste hay out there, and a lot of organic growers use a ton of hay, but I've seen some bad weed problems be born out of that too. So you want to be careful. And then any kind of pesticide, like broadleaf herbicide, I guess it's really more of an herbicide issue than a pesticide with the hay. They use some hay fields use broadleaf herbicide, and that will really damage your plants if you put that out in your garden. So just ask the person you're getting it from. In a city, I've seen really good results with people using leaves in the, to stock, asking the city to dump whatever leaves they're collecting in their yard, and that makes really good mulch for a garden. It is a little bit, I believe it's like really acidic or something. What is the problem with, do you remember, Rachel? The issue with using too many leaves, like oak leaves in particular, it's like the tannins or something. There's some plants that are a little sensitive to just like a full leaf mulch. I know that peppers in particular don't really like it. But most plants don't mind just using straight up leaf mulch, especially if it's kind of sits for a year before you use it. That's really good stuff. What else? Like, there's a lot out there about using like the kind of sheet mulching method of using different kinds of mulch. We do definitely use sheet mulching for long term, but it's hard to work in sheet mulch in my opinion. So like do like a lasagna bed, what they call it, where you put down like a bunch of cardboard and newspaper, and then you put more, maybe you'll put like leaves on top of that and straw on top of that or something like that. And it's this no-till method, but it's really hard to work in there, especially for little things. And even transplants, it's hard to kind of, anyway, I find that kind of annoying to work with, but it's a great way to clear land. So if you have time, so I guess that's another consideration, for your garden, is how are you going to, what kind of ground do you have? Is it a yard? Is it grass that you're turning into a garden? Is it, like some kind of messy, brushy thing with lots of brambles and that sort of thing? What was there before? So what are you turning into? You need to get rid of what's growing there so that you can grow your vegetables instead. And there's kind of a time labor trade-off with that. You could, if you have a lot of time, if you're not in a hurry, then the sheet mulching method works great. So you just throw down, we do cardboard and straw. The cardboard is pretty easy to get, just like dumpster dive cardboard or something. And then you can throw something on top of it, because if you just do straight cardboard, it's going to blow all around, and it'll also kind of dry out on top, and it won't break down very well. But as long as you can put something on top of it, then it's fine. It's a great method for if you have like a year to wait. If you're going to use your garden next year, then you can sheet mulch, and then it's ready to go. If you're in a hurry, then it means you need to clear the land either by hand or with the tractor. If you have like a forest, that's a lot of work. I'm not going to go into that, but most people are probably going to start with grass to turn into a garden. So you can rent
We have a question from Josh. Do you use gypsum or rock dust in large scale applications?
Gypsum lime means?
Josh, can you clarify gypsum lime? I'm just typing.
We use dolomitic lime.
Okay.
So,
It depends on what your soil is. Like if you have calcium or magnesium deficiency in your soil, like it's specific to what kind of lime you use.
yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, that would be a good question for your extension agent, because they'll know what people generally use in that area, like for the liming recommendations. But yeah, we use dolomitic lime, so because that's just what, I guess we don't have the deficiencies. I think it's a calcium in gypsum lime. It's like if you have a calcium deficiency or something. But yeah, it depends. It depends on your soil type. Like, but
you said gypsum soil conditioner for clay soil.
No, we haven't used that.
I think it might not have as much of an effect on the pH. So if you're just looking for the
okay.
impact of the soil or something, I don't know. I don't remember if we used it in California.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I know different types of lime. It depends on like the different calcium magnesium balance. And
Okay.
things,
Yeah, Rachel was saying that it depends. It depends on your soil type, and the gypsum is not as much of a pH modifier. It's more of kind of like I guess a micronutrient. It's like for micronutrient balancing. So yeah, it depends on, you do your soil test, and then you can talk to your extension agent about what people use in that area. Yeah, again, this is kind of like the different schools of philosophy. Some people say, like, you can worry a lot about micronutrient deficiency, or you can just throw a ton of organic matter on it, and that kind of balances it out. So we generally tend more towards just like build up your organic matter and you'll be fine. But some of these micronutrient, like the different amendments that you can use for micronutrients might help with getting like cover crops established, so you can build up your your organic matter. So yeah, it's definitely a consideration, especially at the beginning. You shouldn't have to use those things in an ongoing way, because once you have your fertility built up in the soil, it's not, these little micronutrient imbalances, in my experience, just haven't been that much of an issue. So yeah, and I've known a lot of really good growers out there who kind of just don't even worry about that stuff. And certainly once you've been working the same piece of land year after year after year, you kind of, like, we at this point only soil test every other year, and might even pull back a little bit more from that. In the first few years, you definitely want to soil test every year. And generally do your soil test in like winter, early spring is the time of year. Some people do it in the fall, because they say that it's better to lime in the fall, or to manure in the fall and that sort of thing. But we've always done it in the spring. Yeah.
So you do soil amendments in the winter, right after you test?
So lime, it's good to do in the winter, especially if you're bringing in a big truck, because the lime takes like 6 months to kind of kick in, so you kind of want to do it as soon as possible. But the other soils, like when we do like a potassium rock dust kind of thing, we do that when the plants are established, maybe in June. So it depends on what it is. Another issue for us, at least on a larger scale, you have like access issues. So if you're going to lime a big field, it's good to do it. It's nice to do it like in the winter when things are really frozen hard, like, because that way you're not compacting your fields. So some things you want to do more ahead of time, some things you want to do when it's growing. It depends on what you're growing and what the amendment is. We've used like azomite and other micronutrient mixes, like to cut our, to cut the potassium and that sort of thing, just to make it easier to spread. And that kind of thing you can kind of do anytime. What were you going to say, Rachel?
I just confirmed that gypsum doesn't affect the pH, so it's purely when you're trying to change the structure of your soil.
Oh, okay.
Especially with heavy
Okay, so
soils,
gypsum is to improve clay soils,
without
basically.
affecting the pH.
Mhm.
And then also I know with sheet mulching, like an important thing I've learned is like you don't have to worry about it in a wet climate as much, because you have rain naturally, but if you're in a desert or in a drier environment, you want to make sure that it's wet down, or it'll just kind of turn fossilized and it won't. Yeah. Rachel is just saying another consideration for sheet mulching if you're in a dry climate
is that a really, really deep mulch will actually prevent any irrigation you're doing from reaching the soil. So
And it also won't break down.
and it won't break down. It'll just kind of, the point of sheet mulch is for it to kind of compost in place and fertilize your soil that way. And if you don't have the moisture down at ground level, then it's not going to work. It's not going to compost. So although some people do sheet mulching with perennials and will actually lay like drip tape under the sheet mulch, and that works fine. So again, it depends on your situation. Is that it for any other questions about this? I was going to maybe move on to kind of our planting schedule and like the timing of different planting, that sort of thing. So any other questions about like fertility or water or okay. So I guess I'll start talking about like the crops that we grow at LEF, and maybe I'll touch on the things like crop rotation and that sort of thing, like how we chose what to grow. This is our planting schedule, which I think Stephanie said you were able to like share with the people on the...
Yeah, I can share that.
Okay. So this is a spreadsheet that lays out like our staple crops, our vegetables for storage and processing, and then our other vegetables that we grow, recommended varieties, and then the range of planting dates that are possible with this vegetable, the planting date that we generally do at Living Energy Farm, and then just some notes. So this could be like a reference for people to look at when I'm talking about different crops. And so when you're growing your garden, your first few years are pretty easy in terms of deciding what to grow where. Because you don't have, because you're not worried about rotating your crop families. In the Southeast, like diseases and insects are a big concern, a big issue that we always deal with. And for disease control, in a small garden, insects, it's less of an issue for insect control, but it's definitely a consideration for disease control to rotate your crop family. So that means that you're not growing crops that are in the same family, in the same place year after year. You're moving things around. This helps for diseases. It also helps for fertility so that you don't have the same, certain crops use more or less of different nutrients. If they're pulling the same nutrition year after year after year, that nutrition can be depleted. Of course, every farming rule is made to be broken, and there's some people who swear that like the best way to grow tomatoes is to grow them in the same spot year after year after year. I haven't done it, but some people do it that way. I've definitely seen some bad things happen though with lapses in the crop rotation, particularly around diseases like in cucurbits and that sort of thing. So disease is our main consideration when we're rotating crops. The cucurbit family, so the main families of vegetables that we're growing are the nightshade family. That's tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, potatoes, like white potatoes, ground cherries. I said peppers, right? So things in that family. There are definitely soil-borne diseases is a pretty big issue in the nightshade family. So the diseases live on in the soil, so that's where rotation is really important. The cucurbit family is another major one that we grow. So that's squashes, cucumbers, melons, all the different squashes, gourds. So, when you grow tomatoes in one place, the next year you can grow cucurbit, you can grow something in the brassica family, you can grow, just don't grow like nightshade, like don't follow like a tomato with a pepper because they're both in the nightshade family. Don't follow a squash with a cucumber because they're both in cucurbit family. Other major families are brassicas, especially in our little garden because we do all our spring and fall. We do a lot of our main summer crops out in the field, and then we do a lot of our spring and fall crops in our little garden. So the brassica family is always like finding a rotation spot for the brassicas is kind of tricky. So mainly I give my crops families 3 years, but more is better if you can manage it. And particularly with certain diseases that can be really debilitating. soil-borne diseases, you might have to go as far as like 10 years. Like at Acorn, they're really careful about allium rotation. They go 10 years with alliums. And allium families, onions and garlic. There's some really bad seed-borne diseases in the allium family that they've had a lot of trouble with, so they are very careful about doing a very, very long rotation for alliums. Which that's not too bad because alliums don't take up all that much space, so like you can kind of manage it if you've got enough field space to move them around in. What other crop family? Oh, brassica, as I said, is another big one, and that's, broccoli. We don't grow broccoli, but collard greens, radishes, turnips, kohlrabi, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. We don't grow any of these things. A lot of Asian greens are brassicas, so like the tot soy and bok choy and Chinese cabbage and all that. So that is a pretty big family that you need to be careful about with rotation. Some things you don't need are less important for rotation. Like corn is not that big a deal for rotation. Like you can grow corn in the same spot. It's usually fine because disease is not so much an issue with corn. It's more fertility. So exhausting the soil is kind of, you don't really want to do that with grow corn in the same place year after year because corn is a really heavy feeder. So that's another consideration with rotation. Although honestly, we don't actually do that this much, but you're supposed to. There's like all these farming rules, and then there's some we're really careful about and others not so much. So different crops are characterized as being heavy feeders or light feeders. There's even like a kind of heavy giver category, and that refers to nitrogen. So that's when we were talking about the NPK. Nitrogen is like kind of the main energy source for your plant. I mean, of course, the sun, and it's really what creates like a lot of lush growth in your plants is nitrogen. Corn needs a lot of nitrogen. Other plants need less and actually are a little harmed if you give them too much. Like things like if you give peppers too much nitrogen, they'll like make all this leafy growth, but they won't hardly set any fruit. And generally, if you're using organic soil, like for sources of fertility, so you're using like animal manure, compost, something like that. If you're using like cover crops for fertility, for example, by like turning in a green manure, having too much nitrogen is usually not a problem. It's when you're using chemical fertilizers that too much nitrogen has been a problem. But I have actually seen peppers that didn't set fruit because of too much manure. So it is possible, but it's less of a concern with the organic. But so you have your plants that need a lot of nitrogen, your plants that need kind of a medium amount of nitrogen. And that's things like in the nightshade family, cucurbit family. Most plants, I'd say, are in the like medium category. But so you want to like rotate, and then there's things in the legume family, which are actually nitrogen fixers. They actually put nitrogen in the soil, and they definitely don't want to have too much nitrogen. So it's good to, that's why there's the kind of classic corn soy rotation that like people do like all over most of the Midwest or whatever. So they alternate corn and soy because, soy is a legume. It's a nitrogen fixer. Corn is a very heavy feeder. So, the soy puts the little nitrogen in the soil, the corn takes it out. It's good to switch back and forth. But with neither one of them is disease that much of an issue. It's really more of a fertility management issue why that rotation is the way it is. In a little garden, honestly, I'm not paying that much attention to that aspect of the rotation, but definitely with like field, large scale, crops. And mainly it's because when you're doing things on a field scale, you need to be a lot more efficient with your fertility. So you need to stretch things out and be more economical. Whereas in a garden, you can kind of just pile on more mulch or put on a little more manure. It's a smaller scale. You're not as concerned about the economies of the inputs that you're using. But it is a consideration. If you're going to have corn in your garden, for example, it's just going to more fertility, but it doesn't have the disease issues that some of these other families do. So what was I gonna cover next?
You're getting a lot of compliments, by the way.
Oh, thank you. That's nice. Any other questions?
So far, we're good. Everyone's happy with the content.
Okay. Cool. Well, I could start going through our And then I'll talk about like the kind of the planting season and kind of the rhythm of the planting. Because this is gardening planning, so we're thinking about like when are things happening. That's a really big consideration. In Virginia, there's basically 3 planting seasons. There's spring, there's summer. No, sorry. There's early spring, there's late spring, and there's kind of midsummer. So I call like the early spring is kind of like March, like mid-March, but kind of the whole month of March really. And that's when you're planting your crops that are cold hardy, don't particularly like the heat all that much. Those crops, so those are your spring crops, which are mostly planted in March and mostly done around like June or July. So they're going to quit before it gets super hot. They don't like that heat. So in Virginia, we have this challenge of it goes from being really cold to really hot very quickly. We have a very short cool window. So a lot of these kind of traditional vegetables that are eaten in a lot of like northern climates as crops, we grow them as spring crops and also as fall crops. So that's going to be our 3rd planting season. But we want to be aware of like that it's tricky here because it goes from being so cold to so hot so quickly. And because the cool season is short, we need to grow spring crops that mature quickly. And the same thing is true in the fall. So yeah, we have our spring crops, then we have our like, which are planted in the early spring. Then what we call our like main season or summer crops. And those are actually planted in late spring. So that's like May. And then those will go through the summer. Those are like your heat loving crops. So your early spring crops are like, when I said like those kind of northern vegetables. So like cabbage would be one, greens, collard greens. So things in the brassica family. A lot of roots will be grown that time of year. So like beets or turnips. What else? There's, carrots, onions. Those are spring crops. So in those, you want to get them most done before it gets really hot. But then you get those established like in March, and then they're growing through the spring. In May, that's when like the single biggest round of planting happens in this climate. And those are your summer crops, which are going to be planted mostly in May. Some of them are started earlier, but transplanted in May. And then those go on until the frost comes in October. And those are where we get the bulk of our calories from as growers in this climate. So that's like the corn, those kind of corn, squash, and beans, those like big, very important calorie crops. Sweet potatoes are a major food crop for us. Peanuts, other drying beans. So we do a lot with lima beans and black beans and all kinds of drying beans. Also green beans, those kinds of things you grow in the garden. So everything in the cucurbit family. So these are all crops that don't want to frost. They really don't want to be growing when the frost comes. So you have your growing window is from the last frost in the spring until the first frost in the fall. Our last frost is usually the first week of May. Sometimes we've even gotten in the second week of May, and that's really not fun. Some years we get our last frost in early April or even in late March, but it's pretty unusual. You want to plan for having frost through April and maybe even in our microclimate, like in Charlottesville, by the time you're into May, you're like clear as far as frost. But for us, we have sometimes gotten light frost even the first week of May. So if you plant these crops in the first week of May, they're going to be germinated by the time the frosts are done. So it's a very tight window. But you're trying to get them in as early as you can without risking a frost. So that's from May, June, July, August, September. And then in mid-October is usually when we get our first frost. So that's your growing season for these things. A lot of these crops, some of these crops will take that whole season to grow and mature. So you definitely want to get them in as early as you can while making sure the soil temperature is warm enough. So things like peanuts that are kind of slow. You want to get your sweet potatoes in, peppers and eggplant, those things that take a pretty long time. You want to get them in as early as you can without risking the soil being so cold that it's going to stunt them or that the seed won't germinate. Like peanuts, for example, are really prone to rotting in the soil instead of germinating. Or like a squash seed, if you go too early, might rot instead of germinating. You can get a soil temperature thermometer if you're not sure. That's a really good investment because a lot of people get really excited like, oh, it's warm, I'm going to go plant stuff, but then the soil temperature is too cold and your seed rots, and that's really discouraging. And then by the time you realize your seed has rotted in the ground, you're like, it's getting to be late to replant. So if you're new and you're doing this by yourself, you're not working with someone more experienced and you're really not sure, a thermometer for soil temperature, I recommend it as a good investment, so you know that the temperature of the soil is warm enough to plant your seeds. So yeah, that's kind of what we call our main season crops. And then you're like going through the summer. When you get to like July, well, even June, there's this wave of planting that we do in this climate for our fall crops. But you don't plant your crops in the fall because that's too late. You have to plant them in the late summer, so they have time to get established for the fall. And that's really the trickiest time to be planting stuff, because it's so hot and things dry out so quickly. Keeping the soil moist and everything is a challenge. There's a whole, I don't know if it's a chapter or a section in this book about getting seeds established in August. This is Pam's book, Sustainable Market Farming. I recommend it if you're in this area, especially. It's an awesome resource she gets really specific about planting dates and varieties and that sort of thing. Like a lot more information on this little spreadsheet is nice, but this is like much more information. What? Anyway, was that oh yeah, she talks a lot about how do you get stuff started, and mainly in July and August, the hottest time of the year. It's like, oh man, I got to be planting carrot seeds now when it's so hot. But yeah, if you want to have fall carrots, you need to plant them in August because if you wait till September, they're not going to get big enough before the days get too short and you don't have any more growth. So the spreadsheet that I gave out, like I said, our planting dates for carrots are like 3/15 and 8/01. Some of these other ones, some of these things we don't do both in the spring and in the fall, but a lot of them we do. Oh yeah, I see most of them are down on the other vegetables category. So like kale and collards, we're doing both, and other spring greens, we're doing both in mid-March and then also in August. But it is tricky. I mean, it's a lot of watering. It's a lot of, also you have like insect issues to be dealing with in the fall. So it's, what's that?
Beets and carrots.
Yep, beets are another one that are, so beets you can plant them in March or you can plant them in like July, August window. And honestly, like I think beets are tricky to get because the bugs eat them, Like, so I'd say like, this is like advanced gardening. So the spring window is a lot easier than the fall window. So like, don't get discouraged if you can't get stuff to germinate in the summer. It's tricky, it's hard. There are some tricks that people have come up with. We've actually had some success starting beets in flats because and keeping them protected from the insects, because when they germinate, the grasshoppers come in and it'll just eat everyone. But it means that you have to be watering. Most people do nursery, but like they're going to transplant, they'll start them in the ground because they dry out so quickly in the summer. But yeah, there's tricks for doing it. Some people pre-sprout like carrot seed, that sort of thing. I've had mixed results with that, but some people say it works great. There's like pelleted seed. There's, those crops established. There's also some things you can start in. So I said like you need to start them in August. I guess there's a couple exceptions to that. There's super hardy greens. There's some of them that are really fast growing and very hardy that you can start in September. And like my favorite variety of collards is called Even Star. It was bred by a grower in like the eastern shore of Maryland who does a winter CSA with greens. It's really amazing. He grows all these greens like all outdoors, like all through the winter. And he bred the Even Star collards, which is available through Southern Exposure. I really recommend that one because if you can start that in September because it's so cold hardy that it'll like grow some during warm spells in the winter basically, and you get a harvest like through the winter and into the spring. Daikon radishes are great, also called tillage radishes. We grow them as cover crop. They're also like an excellent, one of the much easier to grow in the fall than other like things in the brassica family. Because with the brassicas, the big issue is insects, especially for your fall planted stuff. So anything that you're planting in the summer, you need to protect from insects somehow, usually a row cover or something like that. Tillage radishes are a lot hardier. Like the insects don't bother them nearly as much as like if you were going to do, kale or turnips or collards or just all the other, broccoli, if you want to do like broccoli or cabbage or something like that. Those things, if you're doing in the fall, you have to start them in June. Protecting them from the bugs is really hard. I've kind of given up on that. But yeah, tillage radish is really easy, really fast growing. The bugs don't eat it as much. It makes excellent kraut.
You have to start in June.
In cabbage or broccoli, you have to start in June. Yeah, some of those things you have to start a lot earlier. They're much slower growing, and they're not as cold hardy. Like so fast growing, and then it's a little more cold hardy, so you can actually start that in like the beginning of September. Make sure you water it. That was my mistake last year. I did a bunch, because the other thing that's fun about, if you have a lot of space, tillage radish is you can just grow it as a cover crop in the field and just broadcast it in the first week of September. It's the easiest thing ever. You don't have to weed it. It just grows. Have any of y'all heard of the book One Straw Revolution? It's a famous book for people who are really into permaculture, and it's really fascinating. I definitely recommend reading it. This is a really fascinating approach to growing small grains without tillage. And he goes into he doesn't do any kind of tillage on any of the stuff he grows, and he has really into he has a bunch of mandarin orchards. This is in Japan. He's a grower in Japan. And I think this was written in the 40s or something. Anyway, this is a while back when he wrote this book, but it's had this resurgence in popularity in recent decades. But in any case, his chapters on growing rice and barley without tillage is an old technique. It's really fascinating. I know a few people who've done it with moderate success and of course with some modifications in this climate. But anyway, I brought him up because he also talks about growing vegetables just by broadcasting seed in the orchard. And I'm like, you know what? You're nuts. Grow a garden. You don't grow in a garden just by broadcasting seed in an orchard. Nothing's going to grow, with the exception of tillage radish. It's an amazing plant. Okay, so yeah, that was my plug for one of the easiest fall vegetables to grow. So yeah, I talked about the 3 planting seasons. The last one, it's really important it's really great to get those crops established, because then when in the winter you've got these crops that, are coming in when you have hardly anything else coming in. It's a lot of, carrots are really cold hardy, so you can leave them in the ground through most of the winter. If the ground freezes super hard for a long time, they will eventually rot. But in this climate, a lot of people get away with, most winters you can get away with just leaving carrots in the ground. So that's really cool. Carrots established in August, you can just pull them out of the ground in February, and they're delicious, and they store super well, so you don't need a root cell or anything like that. You do have to be a little concerned about you definitely need to be concerned about the little rodents, though. They'll go in there and eat your carrots, but if you can get it to work, it's great. So anyway, this last planting season is really important, but it's also really challenging. The middle planting season is really where the bulk of your calories are coming. So I'll kind of step back to that a little bit to talk about kind of the main crops that we grow for the bulk of our calories. Anybody have any questions in there? All right. How are we on time?
We are almost at 2.
Oh, it's almost at 2?
Yeah.
It's been about 45 minutes.
Well, maybe I'm going to talk about our staple crops. This seems like a good thing to focus on. Yeah. And then go into a little more detail about each of our staple crops, even though it's not really garden planning, because you can grow these things in your garden if you want. They just take more space. But it's just really important if you're thinking, especially today, more people are thinking about, being more self-reliant in terms of growing their own food and that sort of thing. And because I could talk for a long time about vegetables and different varieties and timing of planting and different successions and that sort of thing. But I think if we have limited time, I'll probably just focus on the staples for now. And then if anyone has a question oh, I want to grow this, what variety or whatever, then, feel free to ask. And I'll try to talk about what people are most interested in. So on the staple crops, I'll go down the list. You want me to skip oats? No, I'll talk about oats and white potatoes. So we talked about those different planting windows. Oats and white potatoes are spring crops. So you want to plant them in March. Basically, oats get planted like as early as you can. So March 1st, basically, it's kind of as early as the soil can be worked. So you could plant them in February if you can get out there and work the soil. But most winters, oats don't overwinter. So other small grains like wheat and rye, you can plant in the fall for a summer harvest. But oats will freeze out if they're fall planted almost every year. Although this past winter was not a regular winter. But generally, you want to get your oats planted early spring for a summer harvest. We've actually backed off from growing oats because even though we love eating them, but we haven't found a good way to dehull them. They have a naturally pretty tight hull on the oats, so we've been. It's hard to find that kind of small, mid-size equipment for getting the hulls off. So we're not growing our point, but we are growing wheat. That's a pretty major small grain for us. So wheat and rye are both planted in sometime in October. Rye you can plant a little later, although you'll have a better yield if you plant it early November is at the latest. Really better to get it in October. Rye is nice because you can follow a summer crop with rye. Most summer crops will be done by October, and then you can put rye in. It's very cold hardy. There you go. But rye is a really good biomass producer, so it's more valuable to us for cover crop, generally speaking. And wheat is more valuable to us as food. And so but rye and wheat are pretty similar growing habits. I mean, it's nice because you can get them planted in the fall, and then it just, they're really cold hardy. They just hang out in the field, and then in the spring, there's you just let them grow up and do their thing. The main issue with small grains, of course, is having a way to harvest them, and they take up a lot of space. So if you have a lot of space, then I definitely recommend it. It's amazing to have bread from fresh wheat compared to, it's just you can't use regular flour again. You're kind of ruined on regular flour after you grow your own wheat. But you need a way to harvest it. I mean, there's a book, I'm forgetting the name of the book, Raising Small Grains, that talks. Anyway, there's a lot of resources out there to learn how to harvest by hand, but it's a skill. It's not easy. It's a lot of work. It's hard to do it well. So if you have a friend with a little combine, that's nice. But if you have a little garden and you're doing a little wheat for fun, you're probably just going to do it by hand, and that's fine too. The other great thing about these small grains is that they work really well in a no-till rotation. They are a solid stand, so you're not going to be cultivating them anyway. They compete really well with weeds. And if you have the space, you can cover them with a summer cover that then just smothers the summer weeds. And we've got this great rotation of doing wheat every other year and rotating it with rye, which only requires tillage once every other year, and it really builds soil quite well. So you have your wheat, and then you harvest it, and then you get your sorghum sudan is what we use. You could use millet, or you could use other summer covers. But you need something that makes a lot of biomass to choke weeds. And then in October, you can just broadcast rye into it, and then just mow down the cover crop, and then that will help the wheat, or the rye as it was, to help it germinate and get established through the winter. And then when the rye grows up, then you can cut that down and put it back into a summer cover, and then put it into wheat the following spring. So it's a great way to build soil and also grow a bunch of wheat without any tillage. So I talked some about small grains. There are other major staple crops. We do grow potatoes, a fair amount of white potatoes. So white potatoes and sweet potatoes, they're completely different families, completely different growing styles, and completely different in the kitchen too, but the only thing they have in common is that word potato. Really, sweet potatoes are better suited for our climate than white potatoes in a lot of ways. They're a tropical plant. They don't have hardly any disease issues. You can save your own seed and grow your own, propagate your own sweet potatoes year to year fairly easily. White potatoes are trickier because they are native to mountainous areas. They tend to get a lot of viruses in this climate if you try to save the seed year after year. So you're really better off buying seed potatoes. Organic seed potatoes are really expensive. But you can get, if you're not organic, they're pretty cheap and you can get them from your local like feed and seed. If you have to get organic, then you have to ship them in as well. Oh, there's a little sweet potatoes. So white potatoes are a spring crop. They're a mountain crop. They like cool soils, but they don't like frost. So your window to plant them is in, these are sweet potatoes. They're sweet potato babies. Yeah. We'll finish talking about white potatoes. So again, I was talking about like the spring, summer, and fall crop windows. White potatoes can be spring or they can be fall, but they like cool soil and they don't like frost. So those are like your limits on either side. So you can plant them in mid-March. By the time they germinate, it'll be like late April, and by then you're mostly out of the range of frost. Even if they get a little frosted, they'll probably come back anyway. So you can do it that way if you're doing kind of an open cultivated method. A lot of people like to use a lot of mulch for growing potatoes, and that's fine. But that really works a lot better for kind of late planted potatoes. Particularly if you can plant in June your potatoes and then grow fall crop, which is going to be ready around October, like during the frost, that time of year. So you can do it that way too. And the mulch works great because it cools the soil down. That's what they want. They want cool soil but not too cold up in the air. So you can just lay down, a lot of people do this trick, you just lay down your seed potatoes and you just roll mulch right over it, and you don't have to even dig it in the ground because they just set their potatoes like into the mulch, which is pretty cool. And then you just roll up this mulch and then you're done. But yeah, the main drawback of white potatoes, so you need like root cellar conditions to store potatoes. They're one of the more challenging things to store, especially unless you have like a ton of cooler space. They really don't want to freeze, but they need to be cool and moist. So like a basement works pretty well. A real root cellar is better, but you don't want to store them just like out in your kitchen for months and months on end. It's just not good. Whereas sweet potatoes, you can store right at room temperature, any time of the year, and they do fine. So a white potato, you propagate by the potato itself. So you have a potato, it's got all those eyes in it. Each of those eyes is capable of making a sprout. So you get your seed potato. We usually pre-sprout it. So we let it grow a little bit as a whole potato. And then after it's sprouted a little bit, we cut it up into chunks. Each of those chunks should have at least 2 eyes and should be bigger than a golf ball sized or bigger. We let them dry out like a day or two and then plant them. So that's how you propagate the white potatoes. Sweet potatoes are a very different method. So what you do with sweet potatoes, and then we're growing our sweet potato slips right now, so good to show you. Can you see it?
Yeah.
In the picture? So the sweet potatoes, we just stick down we use compost. These are our planting flats. You stick them in some kind of soil or compost. You can also put them in water. That works well too. But when you're doing a bunch of them, it's easier to do it in dirt and a flat than in water. A lot of people who do them on a small scale, you can stick toothpicks in the sweet potato and then put them in a jar of water, and there's one end of the sweet potato where they make more of their slips. So we try to have that part sticking out a little bit, or at least not buried. And if you're doing it in water, you want to have that part sticking up the front. So you keep them moist as we start our process. We start planting them, what was it, like March, like late March was when we stuck them in the dirt, something like that. So this is about 4 weeks of growth, although we have done a few slips, like harvests of slips. And then, so each of these little shoots is called a slip. So then you can get is there like a pair of scissors? I'll just pull it off. So what you can do is you can cut or just pull off one of these slips and then stick this in the water or in some dirt and keep it really well watered. And at each of these nodes is capable of making roots. So that's going to make a new plant. And we could even show, I guess Rachel's going to get the, well, these are the more recent ones. But anyway, there might be one that's actually has some roots on it. But so, yeah, these haven't started making roots yet. It takes them like a few weeks or something to start to make roots. They're just starting to grow. Oh, look at the babies. Yeah, I don't know if you can see, they're like starting to make roots, but they'll grow more. Those roots will keep growing. Oh yeah, there's some down at the bottom. So yeah, each of those slips is going to make a new sweet potato plant. So you can get, I think you can get like, I don't know, it says in Pam's book, I want to say like 30 or 40 plants per sweet potato. It's pretty amazing how much you can get off of just a few sweet potatoes. So yeah, that's how you propagate sweet potatoes. They're tropical plants. They like it hot and humid. So you're growing the slips around this time of year. You transplant the slips in like mid to late May. And then it grows through the summer. Then you keep them in there as long as it stays warm. So we're usually digging them up at the beginning of October. They don't really want, if you're getting like long, like wet and cold spells in late September and early October, you might want to pull them out a little sooner. But if you have like a warm, dry summer and early fall, then you can leave them in a little longer. And then you dig them up, and they store so easily. You can just store them. Like with white potatoes, you have to be careful about light getting on them because they'll turn green and actually like a toxic compound forms if they're exposed to light. Non-issue with sweet potatoes, like you don't have to protect them from the light. They just be at room temperature. They like to be basically at the same temperature we do through the winter, so you just want to keep them in your house. Some people say like, 65 degrees is ideal. I think a little warmer is better just from my experience. They store really well just, in a pretty warm spot in your house, which makes sense because they're tropical plants, so that's what they like. They do store so well, and they're so easy to grow, and you can propagate your own. So for me, that's like sweet potatoes are a really major source of just reliable calories in this climate. So what else do I have? So squash is winter squash is actually pretty similar to sweet potatoes in a lot of ways, like in terms of the way you can cook it. Squash is complicated. There's so many different squashes, like winter squashes. There's 3 different species. It's like in different climates. Are different better worse for different places. In our climate, I recommend the best squashes are in the machata family, and they also like a hot season. So the butternut family is also the machata family. Butternuts are pretty good, but they have a lot of disease issues. It's really important for everything in the cucurbit family. The big issue is fungal disease, and particularly, well, with all of them, especially squashes. So getting a disease-resistant variety is really important. I would recommend anything that is offered through Commonwealth seed growers. They're friends of ours who specialize in breeding for resistance to fungal diseases. They have some excellent winter squashes available that they've been working on improving and crossing and all that. So there's a butternut they call South Anna butternut, which is, it looks and tastes a lot like Waltham butternut with a kind of classic butternut. What's that? But better. It's like butternut, but better. But it actually grows and it doesn't like blight out, in the middle. That's a really important thing. And so anything in the butternut family, so you want to get something disease resistant, like, it's true for all these things. Make sure it has really good water and fertility, and and they're very productive and they're very easy to grow. They take a lot of space. This is true for our sweet potatoes too. They like to spread out and take a lot of space. So you don't want to try to crowd them in a little tiny garden. It's really better to give them as much space as you can. And then they store super easily. So it's very similar to sweet potatoes in that, some people say 60 degrees is ideal for storing squashes in the butternut family. But I've had really good results storing them in the house as well. So it's just I guess 60 is mostly your indoor temperature anyway in the winter, at least where we live. We don't have it at 75. So that range is really good. They store super well through the winter. I've eaten squash that like 18 months in that family 18 months after it was harvested. It's really amazing keeper. And yeah, very, very nutritious. So winter squash sweet potatoes are very similar in a lot of ways, like in terms of how they're stored, in terms of their season, in terms of their nutrition. We grow a little more sweet potatoes because we get squash from our friends, but you can do either or both. Now, the nice thing about sweet potatoes is that, they don't really have any other, they're in the marigold family. They're really in with the rotation compared to squashes, which are in the cucumber family, the cucurbit family. So if you're also growing like melons and cucumbers and all that, you might not have space in the garden in terms of your rotation for squash, but you might have space for sweet potatoes because they take a lot of space. Sweet potatoes take a fair amount of space too, although sweet potatoes maybe not quite as much as squash. So right. I tend to be very biased towards sweet potatoes. A little rivalry going on. So should I wrap it up or talk about peanuts? Corn.
So peanuts and corn are the other staple crops?
And beans. I didn't talk about beans. But
Okay.
yeah.
So we can save that for another video.
Okay.
However, we do have a question about, so a person that doesn't have much experience doing annual gardening, but they plant more perennials so far, they're interested if you have any advice about intensive gardening and beds or for space and sun-limited environment.
Well, raised beds have some advantages, but they also have some disadvantages. But nothing. Raised beds don't give you sun. Like you really do need to grow. Pretty much all these crops I've been talking about really need full sun. So raised beds they're nice in the. They can help some of course they help some with drainage, especially if you have like heavy clay soil. They can be really beneficial. If you have kind of silty soil, as we do, the drainage can kind of be a liability sometimes. They dry out faster. The nice thing about, so it kind of depends on your soil type, whether you want that extra drainage and also the time of the year. If you're talking about, early spring, you might need that drainage if it's a really wet year. It depends how naturally well drained your soil is too. If your spot is really soggy, and you're trying to grow things like spring or fall, then sure, go ahead and use a raised bed. That'll help a lot with making sure that you're not trying to like work in the mud and because every plant that I talked about needs drainage. None of them want to be in the muck all the time. Raised beds allow you to concentrate your nutrition. They're nice, especially if you have kids or you feel a lot of people coming through your garden and you need to be really clear about where to walk and where not to walk. They're helpful for that. All that said, there's also the liabilities, like I talked about, how the increased drainage, if you already have naturally well-drained soil, you probably don't want to raise your beds that much, especially for summer crops, because you're going to have to water a lot more. But yeah, as far as sun limited, I don't know, man, you just need to find a sunny put your garden in. Like you really want full sun. I mean, you're going to have, you could have nice looking annual plants in the shade, but they're not really going to produce much food if that's what you're, that's what you're going for. Okay. So yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
All right.
Some of those spring crops you might
greens,
produce as
maybe lettuce.
Maybe you could get some of those like cooler weather crops for a little longer.
Yeah.
Depends how shady too, I guess.
Right. Or maybe if you have some perennials that like leaf out pretty late in the spring, you could get a spring crop in there before the shade really fills out. That could be a trick.
It's really hard.
Yeah. Rachel was talking about like some greens benefit from being partially shaded as it gets hotter in the year because they don't like the heat as much. So if you get the timing right, that could be a way to use like a shady spot to your advantage. Partly shady. Yeah, that is something where there's this big thing out there about the food forest and having multi-layers. Like you can grow different layers of plants in the same place, but only one of them is really going to produce food. That's, I think, like, if you put strawberries under an apple tree, maybe you'll get apples, but you're not going to get a lot of strawberries. Like you really need to kind of choose your priorities in terms of actual like production. I mean, you can have benefits from having like, you know, certain things growing under your perennials, but they're not going to really produce a lot of food. They might like attract beneficials. They might do other like fine things, but yeah. And even like the corn, squash, beans thing, that is like the classic. It's not, you're not going to have, they're not going to be as productive together as some of them would be separately because of the sunshine, because of the competition for sun. So, but I mean, there could be, and like I said, there might be some other benefits, but you're going to have, if you want more production, you want to, if you want the full possible production, like the full potential of production from your crop, it needs to get sun, you know. It's better if it's not competing with something else.
Yep. That takes care of all the live questions.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, thank y'all for coming out. That was fun. Thanks for everyone here and everyone out in the big wide world.
Yes.
Have a good growing season.